Namaste. This is Yoga Therapy Podcast, and I'm your host, Shira Khan, yoga teacher, yoga therapist, and Ayurvedic wellness educator. In these conversations with experts in the field of yoga therapy, you'll find out what it is and how it can help you and your loved ones to reclaim well-being. We'll touch on physical as well as mental health, physiology, emotions, women's health, spiritual well-being, goddesses, and self-development in the fullest sense. Listening to another story can change ours, so thank you for showing up, and let's begin this journey together. So, hello everyone. Today we are joined by Harpinder Mann. She reached out to me, and she's a go-getter. She's a yoga teacher, and she has this program called Women of Color, no?
Women of Color Summit.
Women of Color, okay. And she works with social justice in her yoga teachings to help empower women, to help women reclaim their intuition and their potential, I imagine. And I thought it was funny because you said social justice equals wellness, and I do the other way. I do wellness equals social justice. So it's really nice because I always do everything backwards. But anyway, thank you for being here. I'm really happy to talk to you, and I want to ask you about how you do the community building. And you're also a storyteller, I read.
Yes, I find as humans, like through the ages, for as long as we've been around, the first way that we actually communicated and stories and myths and things were passed down was orally. So I think it is for all of us and all of our traditions and our ancestral histories to be storytellers. So for me, I know in my teachings and the ways that I communicate with my friends and family, it's through stories. And I find sometimes that's such an easier way to communicate and build relationships. And for the Women of Color Summit, our tagline is social justice plus wellness equals collective healing.
Okay.
And they're right. Like it's the social justice piece. Like, how do we bring our compassion and awareness to folks that need help, where healing needs to be brought in, where justice needs to be brought in. And then we have that collective healing, knowing that it's not only about the liberation of myself, but the liberation of everybody, but also knowing we can't liberate anybody else. We all have to walk on our own path. But just having that compassion and awareness. So I feel very grateful to be able to do the work that I get to do. And I'm very excited to be on this podcast. I know I reached out, but thank you for saying yes.
And it's really nice to hear someone so young be so wise.
I have my moments of
we all do. My last podcast, I was speaking to Janet Seeley, and she was like, "Oh, you're so wise." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." Because you realize, the more you wish to be wise, the more you realize you're not.
No, absolutely right. I realize the more that I think I know, I'm like, oh, I actually know absolutely nothing. And right. And what actually a fresh of breath air it is to be like, I'm always going to be a student. I'm always going to be just this like little baby as I continue to move around the world. And for me, I find that helps my ego take a little bit of a backseat, where it's not like, well, I know this and I know this and I know more than you, because I know I have that tendency. I know I have that tendency to walk into spaces, to be in relationship and feel like, oh, I know more about this. And that creates a wall for me. That creates a barrier. So oftentimes my work is, there's a lot that I know, but there's way more that I don't know. And how can I continue to look at the world with those eyes of curiosity?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and it is wonderful when you meet people who can empty the cup each time, again and again, and just be open to whatever happens. Yeah. And my biggest lesson when I lived with my mum and my daughter in the same house for 1 year, in a very small house, we had like 50 square meters.
Wow.
My biggest lesson was, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I'm also one of these people who loves to be right and loves to know everything about everything. So it was a huge lesson, but it was a very good one, because then, yes, it's much more important to be happy and try and create peace and uplift each other without being righteous.
Helping, yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Because one of the um, poisons in Buddhism is righteousness.
Mm.
Is this sense of like, I'm always right, I know more than you. Because I think that's where like that pride comes in. And
Mm.
oftentimes we're not always right.
Mm.
Um, and I actually I go on Insight Timer to use their like little timer to meditate. And what you were talking about, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? There's actually a quote that they have every single morning, and I'm going to read out the quote because
Okay.
it's similar to what you said. Um, Sometimes people let the same problem make them miserable for years when they could just say, "So what?" Um, and that really made an impact for me because I was like, it's true. Like, how often are we, right, holding on to grudges, holding on to like, I should have that, whatever it might be. And it's really only hurting ourselves at a certain
And
point,
other people.
and right, and other people. And right, like, I'm sure you've seen people that are angry or bitter and how they take that out on others. And it's like, how do we find that peace within ourselves? Um,
Yeah, I see many clients that their bitterness has gotten so far that it's not just a psychological pain, but it becomes physical issues. It really develops into a chronic disease, autoimmunity. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back, all the way back, and start with your story, seeing you're a storyteller. How did you get to yoga? And your background is Sikh. You're Sikh, and
Yes, I'm Sikh. So my religion is Sikhi. And then I am a Punjabi American, Punjab being a state in India, pretty north. And my family immigrated to America. I think my dad was in his like early 30s. My mom was 21. And immigrated to America. My mom had me within the first or second year of being in America. So I was raised very religious, very traditional, Punjabi Sikh family, very conservative, like very controlling, I would also say. And it was interesting. It was interesting seeing my dad in particular being so religious, and we were sat down by the ages of like 2 or 3 in front of our altar that had like Guru Nanak and all the other gurus of Sikhism with like the Japji Sahib in our hands, which is I guess you can say the scripture for Sikhism. And it was like, read this, like embody it. But my dad, as much as he was like always talking about God, always talking being a good person, his actions were not that. Right? It created a lot of cognitive dissonance for me of like the actions not matching the words. So as soon as I got out of the house at 18, my parents were like, we're only going to pay for your college education if you go to this small university right next to us. And I was like, I will take out loans. I have applied for scholarships. I am out of here. Um, and so I ended up getting scholarships. I got student loans. I attended UCLA, and it was interesting. It was towards the middle of UCLA. Um, just the trauma of being raised the way that I was, trying to figure out who I was actually, kind of led me to find yoga,
Mhm.
led me to try to find some sort of healing. At that time, therapy wasn't really a big thing. I didn't understand like how I could find a therapist, how I could pay for a therapist.
Mhm.
Um, and I was like, well, I've heard yoga has to do with healing, so let me go check it out. And the yoga studios in Westwood at that time, Westwood's a pretty predominantly wealthy, affluent area, mixed in with all the UCLA kids as well. So all the yoga studios around were just incredibly asana based, no meditation, no pranayama, like no talking about the teachings or the philosophy. And I felt really out of place. I felt out of place. Um, but I still kept going. I still kept going for the asana. But I do remember talking to someone and I was like, if I'm looking for a good workout, like I'd rather just like run or do weights. And I remember saying that, I'm like, wow, even back then, the ignorance, and maybe not the ignorance, the way the yoga was being taught was as a workout. So to the point that I was just like, well, if I want to go to workout, I would rather just go run and do weights.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I went to India, and I'd been to India many times with my family, but it was my first time going to India on my own. I was the director of marketing for a small education consulting firm. Most of our clients were in India. And so we went to India. And in India, I was like very stressed out. I was stressed out. It was like a big job. And I was like, who am I? I'm just this like very young person. Like, how am I even here? And that like imposter syndrome, loneliness, also being in India away from everybody, led me to be like, okay.
Well, isn't it? It's so different. And then you feel very lonely because you get to know yourself in a different context, which makes you all of a sudden a very different kind of person. You see yourself in another light that you would
Mm,
never otherwise see.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Like being placed in different roles in different environments, you
Mm,
are getting to see yourself in a different way.
mm.
Um, and in India, I started going to the Ananda Sangha, which was in New Delhi. And the way that they taught was just so beautiful. Like
Mm,
they spoke so much about God. They paid reverence to all enlightened beings. So they even had a picture of like Jesus Christ up on the wall. It was in the lineage of Paramahansa Yogananda. So one of the first books I ever read was Autobiography of a Yogi when it comes to yoga. I've read other books. Uh, but it was over a few months of going there, of like practicing meditation, kirtan, practicing asana the way they taught it, very soft, very gentle. I just, every time I left that center, I was in the taxi going back to the hotel where I was staying. I was just crying, just
mm,
like absolutely sobbing because
mm.
I felt this like light within me starting to kind of shine again, which I hadn't realized it was ever dimmed. But I was like, oh, there's a part of me that I didn't even know needed to be relit.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And you realize how far away you've come from yourself and how
mhm,
beautiful we actually are when we return. Yeah, I've had many experiences. One time sitting next to the Ganga at the Shivananda ashram, always
mhm.
next to the Ganga, actually, just tears and tears and tears of not per se sadness, but like this understanding all of a sudden. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like a like reconnection
Mm.
or a finding of something I wasn't even sure I'd been searching for. And I realized just from my own experience of like raised in a very religious household, kind of pushing it away. I remember for a few years being like, I'm atheist. Like, I don't believe in any of that. And then going to the Ananda Sangha and like driving back, and I was like, whoa, I was like, I actually have been seeking this spiritual connection, this like spiritual meaning in my life. And I didn't realize. I
Mm.
didn't realize until I came to India. I started coming to the center. We started practicing in this way. And I guess the rest is history. After that, I was hooked. I was like,
Okay.
what does it mean? What does it mean to live as a spiritual being in this human flesh body? What does it mean to like I feel like yoga just gave me this way to understand the world when before I didn't really know. Because
Mm.
before I feel like what I was told was go to a good university, you get a good job, and then in the job you keep getting promotions, and then it just felt empty.
Yeah, it
And
is empty. It's totally
it
empty.
is, right? It is empty. And I felt like I just didn't have any way of understanding the world around me.
I think the whole business thing and this ladder building, it's just always creating this out of reach thing, like heaven, it's this thing that you're never going to reach and you're
Mm,
never content and we never stop to just enjoy what's here. But I remember also as a kid, my parents were atheists. They didn't
mm,
believe, like my mother was from Catholic background, my dad from Jewish, but they were both not practicing. And my dad had this book of palmistry reading and I was 4 or something, and I used to look in that book and see all the images, and there was the planets and connected to astrology. So it was very interesting. And it just always took me back to this other world, something I
mm,
was connected to some time in the past. And when I was a kid, I used to have flashbacks of other lives, and I just knew I'd had other lives, but I'd never verbalized it. We never talked about it. Like we were talking about words. It's only when you put things into words that it becomes a conscious concept. And then it was only later when I discovered yoga and the same book as you from the autobiography of a yogi. It was also my first book, one of the first books. Yeah, it's funny. And I think it's something every yogi should read. Yeah. But it was then that I started to realize, everything just fell into place. And you start to connect the dots of your life and the importance of everything. And then you remember what the essence is of yourself. And you can actually name it. You can actually see it. You can feel it in everywhere. And every moment becomes special. Yeah. Yeah. It was, and yeah, you hear this, like I do these stories. I've done what now, 70 podcasts, and everyone says the same. It's like coming home when they did their first yoga class. Some people hated it, but there was a point where they came home. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, this is lovely. And I want to come back to this point because I've discovered this in the last, like if we're looking at our culture now, our collective global culture, we've lost myth, we've lost meaning, we've lost reverence, we've lost awe, we've lost our stories. So why do you think that's important?
I mean, I think if we're talking about yoga in particular, most of what was around, say 10, 12,000, 13,000 years ago was all passed down orally.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about a lot of our, say, spiritual traditions, whether it's in India, whether it's in indigenous cultures, again, they were all passed down orally. And I think there's something, and I know this for myself, of not keeping something just in my mind, to actually getting it out there in the form of a story. And I came back from a Vipassana retreat a week ago now, and in the evenings in the discourses, Goenka ji, a lot of the stories that he tells, it was very interesting. This is my fourth time going. And I realized like a lot I didn't remember. I didn't remember like the technique kind of changes halfway through, but the stories stayed in my mind. Like he was about to tell the story, and I was like, no, I know exactly what you're gonna say. I know exactly the theme of it. And I think there's just something about stories that makes it easier for us to even understand the world around us. He was telling the story about the Buddha and a young mother that had lost her child. She had wanted her child for a really long time. He was maybe 2 years old. She lost him, and she just refused. She was like, no, my baby's just sleeping. Like, he's going to come back. And like was just walking around the town. I mean, obviously, no, had lost it. Yeah. And Goenka ji says, by some good karma of a past life, she stumbles upon the Buddha. And she was like, well, the Buddha is this like enlightened being, this super magical being. When that's not the way he teaches. And that's also the other thing about when I think about these stories is in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in yogic mythology, it's all stories, it's all stories that tell us things, that give us understandings about the world around us. Go ahead.
I just want to add something. Stories you will remember, like you said, because it also forms a picture in your mind. So you're using another part of your brain. And also it brings up emotions because you reflect towards it, and that connects you to the person in the story. Yeah. So I think we have this world of information, but there's no story, there's no meaning. And we don't connect. We're so disconnected because of all this information. It has no meaning. We have no meaning in the end. We're not connecting, we're not bonding, and we're not getting those juicy hormones that make us feel alive and good and loving and open towards others and open towards the awe of life. We're shutting down all these beautiful doorways.
Right? Because if you look at like Hinduism myths or yogic mythology, there's like stories about the trees and stories about elephants and stories about like animals and the meanings that they have. And I feel like that for me starts to be able to like develop greater relationships. Like, what's the meaning of a turtle? What's
Mm,
the symbolism behind a turtle? And how can I apply that to my life in the story form? Um,
mm,
but something I wanted to get back to,
mhm.
in case like people are listening, like, wait, what happened? What happened with the Buddha and the woman and the
Yeah,
child?
sorry, yes.
So she stumbles upon the Buddha, maybe because of a good karma of her past life. And she says, Buddha, like my child, like has died. That's what everyone is telling me. Can you please bring him back to life? Please bring him back to life. And what Goenka says is the Buddha, through stories, through getting them to do things, gets people to form their own understanding,
Mm.
gets people to have this like realized understanding,
Experience,
realized wisdom, right? It's that difference
experience.
between also intellectual and realized embodied wisdom.
Well, it's an
Uh,
experience. I think that's why yoga is so effective. You experience it. I'm not just teaching you. It's yours once you've experienced it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and so the Buddha tells the woman, okay, bring me back 3 grains of rice and I'll bring your child back to life. And she's like, oh, that's easy. I can do that. And he's like, okay, but there's a caveat. You have to go get the 3 grains of rice from a household that you don't know anybody there. And she's like, okay, I can do that. I'm going to go now. And he's like, wait, but you have to make sure at this household that no one's died there. Just find a household where no one's died. And she's like, okay. She spends an entire day knocking on different doors. Hi, the Buddha said he's going to save my child. Can I please get 3 grains of rice? The people at the house, oh my God, yes, yes, we would love to help you. But she's like, wait, you have to first let me know, has anyone died in this house? And house after house, it was like, oh yes, my grandma died. Oh
Mm.
yes, my son died. Oh yes, my wife died. And she just had this realization when she came back to the Buddha, and she was just like, everyone dies. Everyone has
Someone.
suffered death, right? Everyone has that experience. It's not just me. And she had this like realization, that realized wisdom set in.
Mm.
Um, and I share that story because it made such an impact on me. Because I think, again, thinking about that story, it's like I have that intellectual understanding. I'm going to die. I understand that intellectually, but from a realized, embodied wisdom place, I don't think I truly understood that. Because I
Mm.
think if we all truly understood, I'm going to die, my friend's going to die, everyone's going to die. It's the natural cycle of life. I think we would treat each other a little bit differently. I think there would be more reverence for this life that we have and how precious it truly is, because we don't know when we're going to pass. We don't know whether it's like tomorrow, the day after, in many, many years.
Mhm.
And I think that's that power of story when it's told in that way. You
Yeah.
understand it in a very different way, in a
Yeah.
very, very
Yeah,
different way.
because like you said, you relate to it, and therefore it's also part of you. And that's an important thing that you bring up. Our society and culture, the global culture, has become averse to death, averse to struggle, averse to suffering, averse
Mm.
to depression. We're all supposed to just take a pill or move it to the side, put the old people in a home so we don't see them, you know. So we're not even used to death. And then virus comes along and we're all freaking out. It's a normal part of life. Sorry, people have got to die, yeah. And
Yeah.
this, yeah, like you say, we don't have, it's only because someone can die that we appreciate them alive and
Mm.
can feel the juiciness of their existence, because you
Mm.
never know when someone's gone. So I had that lesson very early. Someone died in my family or took their own life when I was 10. So for me, there was always this big question about life and death. Why
Mm.
are we alive? And every time I saw someone sad, whether I knew them or not, it was always, are you okay? Do you need someone to talk to? Because you never know who's ready to end it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or you just don't know what's going to happen. So really, I always tell people, I know I love you, just to make sure that before they leave, they know I'm there loving them.
Um, yeah, with the Women of Color Summit, in a lot of our languaging and things that we put out, it's talking about how we all have this innate desire to be truly seen, to be truly heard, to have that connection with others. And it's this like innate desire to belong, to feel like we have that community. And I know for a lot of us, we don't have that. And I know for me, in my own practice, in my own life, it's been a very intentional practice for me, is who is my support system? Who are my people? And I think there, especially during the pandemic, I think there's also been that understanding of it's not just about my own healing, my own progression. It's like this collective healing that needs to happen. We need to take care of each other.
Yeah, I think that's been a very clear message for everyone. It doesn't matter how conscious or unconscious the people are. I think it's bubbling up to the surface of everyone's consciousness, and it's been a good thing, I think, in many ways. For sure, there's been terrible things too, but it's also bringing up all the most disgusting stuff of ego and power struggles for us to look at. We can't fix something if we can't see it. So again,
Absolutely.
naming the thing and seeing the darkness. How can we address it if we don't know it's there, or if we're pretending everything's lovely and great, and let's just be positive and keep going down the track that we've been going, which is a pretty big dead end.
No, absolutely. I'm reading Love and Rage by Lama Owens. And he's I think calls himself like a Buddhist minister.
Okay.
And
Lama
he,
what?
Rod Owens.
Okay.
Yeah, and the book's Love and Rage. And there's one part in the book that I really just, I can't stop thinking about it. And I just read it a few days ago when he talks about sometimes we get so obsessed with being perceived as a good person that we're unwilling to look at the parts that might be, and I'm doing air quotes here, bad. We get so obsessed with like, I need people to see me as a good person. All these other parts that might be more shadowy, that might be judged, that might be bad, whatever it might be, I'm just going to push it away. And I think with these practices of yoga, with the teachings of yoga and Buddhism, it's about how everything deserves equal awareness. Everything deserves to rise up to the surface so we can actually view it for what it is. And for some of the things, maybe there's purification that needs to happen. Maybe there's some greater healing that needs to happen. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about that, is how we can get so obsessed with like, I need people to think I'm a good person. I don't want anyone to label me as bad. So I can't bring up these parts of myself. And oftentimes I feel like those parts of ourselves are going to come out. We can't keep repressing things forever. They're going to come out in different ways. And maybe it's going to be even more hurtful, harmful ways. And we were talking earlier about the sexual scandals, right?
It's always this. If you look at all the yoga traditions where this sexual abuse has happened, it's because the ego has repressed a certain part of themselves. They've blown a part of themselves up to such a point that that other thing that they haven't looked at or addressed becomes such a big shadow that it's overpowering them. Yeah. Yeah, very true. And yeah, I think this comes back to the domination system that we have, this always fearful there's not enough, always fearful that we have to be the best, not good enough, a scarcity mentality, which has been about, I was talking last week with Sharon Kogan. She's a religious studies professor. It was very interesting. So she's very much on the goddess journey and understanding the patriarchal systems and the psychology of our present culture. And yeah, she was talking about that all these religions that have come from the Middle East, it was a very hard life. So they really had to like take and grab and keep and hold. And there was no sharing. So the religion became that way. Of course, there were these messiahs and these prophets who had wonderful teachings, but it soon got taken over by the culture and the mindset of the people. And that is what spread throughout the world. And this is what's formed our modern day cultures, is still based on this. There's not enough for everyone. And you have to be really good and really at your top. And that means now that means positive and inclusive and no gender and, all these things. Now we have so many labels we have to stick on. It becomes almost impossible to have a conversation without being fearful of what you're saying, because you
Mm.
can say something that might offend someone, because now we have taken ourselves again away from the center of ourselves, which is everything. And all these
Mm.
nuances you were just speaking about, being able to hold the dark and the light together. And that's what's so beautiful about Vipassana and mindfulness, is just sitting there with everything that arises, the good, the bad, the terrible, the ghastly. It's all a part of us. We are the devil, we are God, we are the whole shebang. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that, because in one of our Women of Color Summit group programs, Deepening Your Spiritual Practice and Community, we talk about like the difference between the Indic religions, and it's escaping me now what the term is for. Um,
Monotheist.
yeah,
Monotheism.
yeah, monotheism. But there's another word like that we can, and maybe it'll come to me later on. I'll bring it up, and maybe I won't.
Mhm.
But the differences and how our world has been really taken over by the monotheistic religions and this power structures that we have, and these systems of oppression and dominant culture. And I know for myself, like again, when I didn't have the words to be able to apply to these things, it was a lot of internalized racism. It was a lot of internalized oppression where I was like, well, it must be because I'm not good enough. It
Mm.
must be because I'm not smart enough. It must be because, and it was all very much me focused. And I
Mhm.
think what's starting to change now is we're starting to understand, have this language for what you were talking about earlier. Why is the world the way it is?
Mm.
And why is it actually because of the dominant culture, the systems that we have, and not just a person-based thing? It's not just
Mhm.
because I'm not smart enough, I don't have all this money. It's not because of that. It's because of the systems that we have that have been
To benefit a few. Yes.
exactly that have been very intentionally set up in the ways that they have.
Mm.
And
And they're still playing, we're still riding on the back of these systems, which are created, I think, 13th century or even 3rd century BCE. So it's so old and
yeah,
ingrained. Yeah. And I think, we had this nice lull of democracy the last few decades, but it was actually the underground. There was a lot of dirty darkness going on, having us all like blissed out thinking we were on this spiritual progress together, but actually there's still a lot of crap. And now the cracks are coming and everything's pouring through, and we have to start cleaning up.
yeah, we need to start really
Addressing
looking at
what
it
was in.
honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's um I'm studying with one of my teachers, Vikram, and he was talking about how right now we're in the um, age of Kali,
Mm.
and age of
At the
Kali
end.
being
We're
at
at
the
the
end,
end. Yes,
right?
yes,
Like
we're
age
nearly
of like
there.
decay and destruction. Well, he was saying after this, it just like it all ends and then we start completely over. And I was like, I don't really know what that means. It
Yeah.
completely ends. I'm a little scared. But something he said that I really liked, he was like, yes, like it's the age of decay and destruction. And he's like, sometimes, you look around and it seems like the goodness is declining. It
Mm.
seems like that there is more bad news. And I live with my in-laws and they have the news on all the time. And if I were to listen solely to the news, I would be like, the world is ending tomorrow.
Exactly.
Right? And but what he was saying, he was like, while you might look out and you think the goodness is declining day by day, he was like, that doesn't give us an excuse to be like kind of wipe our hands and like, okay, well, I'm done. I
Up.
can't
Yeah.
work anymore. I give up. Like it's just what it is. He's like, we still have to keep doing our actions.
Yeah.
And this is in in relation to the Bhagavad Gita, the course that I'm doing with him, where we still have to do our dharma, we still have to do our actions to make the world better in any way that we can.
Yes.
And making the world better is making ourselves better. Maybe that's our dharma. Maybe it's bringing these teachings to other people, whatever it might be. He was like, it's still not an excuse to just kind of like wipe your hands off and just walk away. Well, I give up.
Yeah.
Because it can be a
I
little.
know, I know. There was like, I think about 6 months ago, I was ready to just say, throw in the towel. I was ready to just get a job like everyone else and not care, make my 2,000, 3,000 a month, not care that I'm not going against the system, which I've done all my life, and that's why I'm not rich. But then I was like, no, I can't. I just can't, And I have a daughter and she's angry. Like she would like to have more money. But then I'm like, one day you're going to be thankful I didn't do that road, because I would have added to the world that we don't want. But I listen to, like you were saying, I don't listen to the news either. I listen to astrologers just to get like a wider lens of what's going on. And one of these astrologers, she was telling that, yes, there is another 6 months that's going to be intense with a lot of negative stuff coming through. Then there's another all the way up to 2024 before the changes start coming, that it's more positive. But she also said, which I thought was very inspiring for all of us light workers, is that even if there's just 1% of humanity that is working on themselves and staying connected to the light and doing the dark shadow work inside themselves, that is enough to pull the 99% with us, because our frequency is much higher. So that frequency breaks into the tamas, the darkness of the other 99%, and it can carry it through. So that was so, like, I know there's more than 1% out there who are good. I think it's more like 90% are good, if not 99% are good. It's such a small amount who are consciously not thinking about others. And yeah, I think even that's becoming a conscious concept for most people is what's going to break it open for us and turn the tide that we're moving into thinking about others and building communities and really thinking about how can we include others without being too extremist about it. We don't need to make it like this is the way. There are many ways. There are many ways, and we can all do it at whatever level. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, your parents-in-law watch so much news. That must be really hard to walk past all the time.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I'm just like, if I were to listen solely to the news, I was like, I would be convinced that it's all over tomorrow. And it's really interesting the way that the media and different things feeds us things because yes, like obviously there are horrible things happening all around the world, but it's also I've been thinking a lot about coming back from Vipassana. I've severely reduced my phone usage, my internet usage, my social media usage. So I was like, all this like intake that we have consistently, constantly, it's not good for us.
No.
It's not good for us. We're not meant to be taking in this amount of information. We're not meant to be having these amount of reactions back to back to back to back to back.
Because when are you digesting it and when are you shitting it out?
Right? Like, when are you digesting it? When are you?
Ahara, vihara. You have to take in, you have to put out. And people are just taking in food, taking in mental food, taking in emotional crap, but we're not expressing. Like, even now walking on the streets, I don't know what it's like. It's probably different in Los Angeles. I imagine people are a bit more open, but here people are just so repressed. I walk around on purpose with my music on really loud, like on my phone, and I sing on the street, in the forest, I don't care, in the shop. And first people look at me pissed off, but then there's people who are thinking, actually, it's good, we're all so silenced. We've worn these masks for 2 years. We've shut our mouths and now we've shut our eyes and we're shutting our ears. We're shutting down. It's not healthy. So I just keep doing it. I don't care. let people think what they think, yeah, eventually they're going to realize, oh yes, we're humans, we are supposed to connect, we can sing, we can even dance on the street, why not? That makes us happy, and it makes others happy if we can open up a little.
Yeah, and I think that's why there's such a need for, and I'll take it back to the Women of Color Summit,
Yeah.
um, these like community spaces, and they can be community spaces, they can be ecstatic dance, they can be these very intentional yoga classes, they can be Dharma talks, they can be meditation retreats with Buddhism, like whatever it is that gets us to really like be there fully and release,
Mm.
to embody.
Mm.
And I think it's so important to have these like safe spaces where you can bring all parts of yourself, and there's no danger of being judged. There's
Mm.
no danger of like, well, if I express myself in this way, then someone's going to give me like some squinty eyes, or I'm going to be perceived in a way I don't want to be perceived. And it's like, how, and I think earlier to what you were saying with the astrologer is like these light workers, these holders of space in this way, like we need to keep doing this work. We need to keep doing this work so we can really fully creatively express ourselves and be safe to do so, and not have to pretend that I am a 100% good person all the time and that's my only identity. And it's like sometimes I'm a shit person, and my shittiness came from a reaction that I had. And in that moment, I had that reaction. And then later on, when the light of awareness comes back to me, I can reflect on that, like, maybe next time I'll be better about that. But maybe next time I'll have that same reaction and I'll think about it again. And it's a slow sort of like learning, unlearning, and this like compassion we can have with ourselves. We're not going to be perfect. We don't have to present ourselves in a certain way, because that can be so limiting and that can be so damaging to have to try to present ourselves in a certain way.
Yeah, it's damaging for everyone, self and other, because then others copy. So what's a good way to build community? How do you do that? And how are you doing that online? You're doing it live?
Yeah, good question. So, the Women of Color Summit was started early 2020. So it was really started at the beginning of the pandemic, because everyone was obviously being siloed into their homes. There's a lot of fear going on. What is this COVID? How is this going to affect us? And during that time, we started to see a lot of like conferences, online summits popping up. And it was depicting majority white folks as these tradition holders, as these experts within like Buddhism, traditional Chinese medicine, yoga. And me and my co-founder, Irene Lowe, just like, what is this? Like, why aren't the tradition holders being the ones represented as the experts, like the indigenous tradition holders? And that's where the Women of Color Summit was really founded. And in the past now, goodness, like over 2 years, close to 3 years, we've held annual online conferences that spanned across 6 days. And we had live workshops, we had speaker conversations that we recorded. We've held in-person retreats. We're actually having one next month in Los Angeles. And we've held, oh, go ahead.
Oh, nice. I'm glad. Yeah.
We've held group programs, and that group program, the first one was, I believe that first one was a month and a half long. The second one we ended up going for 3 months because we wanted to form a more intentional community. We do monthly new moon gatherings. And so I think we're slowly starting to move into in person now that things are opening back up. But I think is really important. It's really important when we were kind of all being forced into our homes to be able to have some sort of connection. And I think that's where the Women of Color Summit was really instrumental. And on a personal level, I live with my partner. I live with my partner's parents. And we moved to LA over a year ago from New Orleans. And we had a choice. Do we live with them or do we find our own place? And we were talking about it. We went and looked at apartments, and one, the cost. I was like, it's just expensive. And then second, I was like, why would we move away from an already supportive community in your parents? Like, why would we intentionally silo ourselves? Um,
Mm.
so that it's been so lovely. I hope they love having me as much as I love living with them. It's been so wonderful. And other ways of forming community is like for me, I keep up with my friends,
Mm.
texting, calling, FaceTiming. How are you doing? Do you have any news?
Mm.
Um, and it's such an intentional practice for me. I'm not always good at it. And I make sure if it's like a birthday or you've had a baby to always send something. I love sending
Of
stuff in the
course.
mail.
Yeah.
Yeah. And something I'm starting up, I did this a little bit towards the beginning of the pandemic, is once a week, I'm mailing out a letter to someone, like a handwritten letter and I'm
Oh, that's
compiling
beautiful.
like, yeah, everyone's like names and addresses. And just like every week, I'm just sending I'm calling it a letter of love, just like thinking about you,
Oh,
how are you, blah, blah,
that's so
blah.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah, and it feels good. It feels good to do it as well, to actually
of
sit
course.
down to think
Of
about
course.
how do I love this person? What do they mean to me? It like
Yeah.
releases those like love juices. So
Yeah.
it's selfish. It's selfish as well.
Yeah, but it's also reminding us how good it is to get a nice card, to get that real card and that someone took the time to write us, because this texting gets so also taken for granted. We've lost the appreciation for that. And I loved what you said about choosing consciously to stay with your in-laws because it is that community building. And I think so many people see it as a degrading position because, oh, you're not independent. And that's
Mm,
another thing. We've become so independent, so individualized that we are disconnected again. There's no connection. Yeah. And I wanted to talk to you about, but I don't know if you have time, about identity. Do we have time for that?
yeah, I think if this was a last, I could talk to you for hours. This has been so
I
much
know.
fun.
So
I
can
have
I.
some
I could always talk for hours.
yeah, let's talk about it.
Okay, so for me, I want to speak about identity because I read it on your website. We want to liberate ourselves from identity, race, gender, all this. But I also see on, yeah, social media, obviously, I don't look so far, or even in family and friends, that people want to distance themselves from gender or from whatever. But then I think it's being taken too far. And then again, there's the political issue that they want to remove our gender from our passports and all
Mm,
this kind of thing, where then it becomes, then you don't become anything, you just become a number, which is
mm.
a possibility. And then we're not people anymore. So, yeah, I would like to speak about the importance, because we talked about there is this aspect of self that needs to exist in this world, this common, very complex current world we live in. And yes, how do we navigate, because it's a very fine line between liberation from ego identity and at the same time having an identity, and ego self, because ego is connected to immunity. Like when we point to ourselves, we are
Mm.
actually pointing and tapping our thymus gland, which is also our immune center.
Mm.
So it's saying me and thymus is protecting the self. And there is a self. There is a need for self in a world. It's your existential separateness, which makes you healthy.
Yeah. Um,
And I'm not so deep into these conversations. I have friends who don't identify as sexually this or that, and for me it's so not vague, but it's like very unclear,
mm.
and people
Yeah,
get
I mean,
upset when you just say the wrong thing because it's not politically correct, and then it's like, wow, can we still have conversations?
I mean, it's an interesting time that we're living in. I think it's as a result of people perhaps being so oppressed for so long, not seen for
Mm,
so long, that now we're trying to figure out, well, who am I actually? And
mm,
how do I want to be perceived? And how do I want to be seen and heard?
mhm,
So there's a little bit of a reckoning happening, There's a little bit of well, who am I? And how do I want to be perceived? And what does that mean in terms of my gender identity, my sexual orientation? And I think when we think about um, one of the goals of yoga, if we're looking at Patanjali, one of the goals of yoga being the separation of Prakriti and Purusha. So Purusha being this consciousness that we all have. It's the consciousness that connects all of us. It's this consciousness that, if we're reincarnated, goes on to the next life and the next life. And we're trying to separate this liberation, this moksha of Purusha from Prakriti. Prakriti being, anything that's matter, our body, our mind, our thoughts, this table, the trees, and this separation. I'm never going to know that, because then, I'm just floating in consciousness. I've been liberated, I'm enlightened. So I think there's this understanding of, when we're talking about liberation in this way, in a spiritual level, it's this understanding that I am the same as you. At a divine level, I am divine, you are divine, I am God, you are God, or however you want to perceive that, is that we're equal. We're equal from a very spiritual perspective. And I think that's that conversation of, if we're looking at the goal of yoga liberation, I think if we're looking at it from a human perspective, we have our race, we have our ethnicity, we have our nationality, we have our gender, we have our sexual orientation, we have all these identities that help us form our personality, that help us form the way that we communicate with ourselves, we communicate with other people. And I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary to have these identities.
Yeah.
And
can I just interject?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can it also be, so like you were saying before, because there's been a history for this person or certain people that they haven't been seen, or they just don't know who they are, and so they need these kind of identities or disidentities, I guess, for some people, that it becomes so important, because then you have at least a place to stand. Oh, this I am, this I am not.
Right? Because what is typically what we consider normal? So cisgender, heteronormative, male-female relationship. And so if we spend so much time categorizing as this is the norm, that I feel like then there's other folks being like, well, this is my identity. And I feel like then becomes that conversation of like, well, it seems like so politically correct. They want us to say it this way. And it's like, well, we can perceive it that way, or we can start to understand that there's been layers of oppression that have kept them as abnormal, that has shown us that this is what's normal, cisgender, heteronormative, say being white, and then everything else becomes abnormal. So I think there is
so it's that naming thing again.
It's the naming thing,
the word, just for you to become conscious of the concept of what you feel connected to.
Yeah, it's the naming. I think it's also the reclaiming of identity. It's just starting to understand, like, who am I from a place of identity? Because I think with the Woman of Color Summit, for example, and I go back to this, is it's a space intentionally for anyone that identifies as Black, Indigenous, woman of color, and non-binary person of color. So even for us, like, there is some identity work that's going into this. Because thinking about, for me as a woman of color, living in the West, living in Los Angeles with parents who were immigrants from India, what's my place in this world that I'm currently living in? How am I perceived by others? What are the biases that go into presenting myself in this way? Because, like, if we're talking about, sometimes I see the spiritual gaslighting, well, we're all one, I don't see color. And it's like, well, you're doing that in a very manipulative manner. Because yes, we can have the understanding that spiritually, we're the same, right? But then intellectually, from the way that we're actually living, you see my color. Yeah. You see that I am presenting as a woman. I have long hair. I am thinner. You see those things. And to pretend like you've put on blinders and you don't actually see that, it's just not true. It's just not true.
Yeah, that's, and so I think it's bypassing. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So I think there's let's think about like spiritually, why are we here? How am I connected to everything? But
But
then from
then
a
bringing
human
it back
form,
into this world right now with
yeah,
context. Yeah,
absolutely. And we
yeah,
and we need both. We need to
yeah.
have that understanding of both. And last thing I'll say to this, um, again, Vikram on our session on Sunday, he was talking about how we have our spiritual dharma and then our material dharma. So we
Mm,
have our dharma, like maybe it's having a job, having a family, in this material world. And then we have our spiritual dharma. How are we continuing to connect back to spirituality? So I
mm,
think it's this understanding there's both. It's not just one or the
mm.
other. It's both.
Yeah, that's nice. Nice way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah. This has been so good. Good getting to know you. Do you want to share a practice or do you have time for a practice? Maybe we could do a journaling thing. Is there something like a prompt for us to work on?
Yeah. I always like to finish when I am prompted for practice, just for breath observation, just for some quiet, internally tuned in. So is that something we could, yeah?
Sure, sure. I'll
Cool.
just mute myself.
So I'm going to sit a little bit further up on my chair, having the soles of my feet pressed down against the ground. For me, I have my palms face down on top of my thighs, closer to my knees. Good, sitting up tall here. Chin parallel to the ground, perhaps slightly tucking the chin in. And I'll invite the eyes to close or the gaze to soften. Good, beginning to tune the awareness inwards. For myself and Shira, I know we've been spending a lot of time communicating to one another. And to any of the listeners, you've been spending some time listening. And so this is going to be a very intentional practice. Instead of tuning outwardly, to tune inwards. Begin to notice the parts of body that have contact against the ground or chair or couch or bed. For me, that's soles of my feet, the base of my sacrum against the chair, my palms pressing down against my legs, the length of my spine supporting to sit upright, and the head balance between front and back plane of body, between right and left shoulder. So awareness of physical body. And we'll begin to draw the awareness to the breath. Noticing how breath breathes the body. Invitation to follow the inhale. All the way to exhale. Back to inhale. And I'll invite now a practice of observing the next 10 rounds of breath. Staying with the breath mindfully. Maybe with every exhale, you can relax the shoulders down a little bit more. Maybe the face starts to soften. Good observation of 1 to 2 more rounds of breath. Good. We can bring the chin down towards the chest as a way to bow to our inner light. And in this place, beginning to gently open the eyes, letting in a little bit of light in at a time. First looking down at yourself, and then coming back for us to one another. And then for those listening, back to your phone, back to whatever else you may have been doing.
Thank you. Yeah. Good old Vipassana.
Just such a wonderful practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. This is wonderful. I really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. It was really nice to meet. Yeah. Is there anything you want to leave listeners with? Anything you felt you need to say, or how they can find you? I will put it in the show notes, but you can always just share.
Yeah. So I run the Women of Color Summit. If that's something that you're interested in, you can go on our website, womenofcolorsummit.com, and that's WOMXN. Same handles across our Facebook, our TikTok, our Instagram. For myself, you can find me on harpindermann.com. On Instagram, I'm Harpinder Mann Yoga. I work primarily with folks of color. I also teach at recovery centers. I teach kids with autism. I also love working with pregnant peoples. And my love is really working with folks one-on-one. So if there's something that you're interested in, please feel free and reach out. But this has just been such a lovely conversation, lovely time. And what I'll leave with is, taking that intentional time throughout the day. If you're washing dishes, can you really notice your hands on the dishes? If you're for me, I'm in the backyard, and sometimes I'll take my Kindle out there, and I've been spending more time now before I open my Kindle to actually look out around. I'm like, oh, is that a bird? And like really, pay attention to my surroundings, feel the seat of my sacrum pressing down against the chair that I'm sitting in, just becoming really aware of my surroundings, of my sensations. And that's where, again, Vipassana is so powerful, bringing that sense of like mindful engagement. So I'll leave it with that, because that's been such a powerful practice that I've been really doing now for the last week and a half. And it's helped me become just much more aware and move from a place of like more gentleness, more compassion, not just like being constantly reactionary all the time.
Yeah, and patience, and even just the thoughtfulness, isn't it? And that insight, constant insight to all the choices we have, all the abundance that is, all the pathways we could possibly take. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
And my pleasure. Namaste. Thank you, listeners, and have a wonderful week. Wishing you all the best. Bye.
Bye.
So thank you everyone for staying to the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I really love doing these talks with these amazing people. And if you want to know more, just take a look in the show notes. There's plenty of links and ways to connect with either the guest or myself. If you want to work with us or find out more about us, just check out the information